people aren't really comfortable going down that aisle with the chips and being blinded by, yellow, red, and blue, just so many colors. I'm kind of getting dizzy even thinking about it. We know what that aisle contains. That aisle has the sodas and the chips and sometimes the cereals that we know are not really great for us.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the podcast for doctors by doctors. My name is Dr. Ned Palmer. I'm going to be joined today by Dr. Gerald Cox, who I'll introduce in a moment here. We're very excited to have him back on the podcast for doctors by doctors. Today, talking about nutrition, food is life, food is health, and how to make sure that we can actually do something actionable as clinicians when it comes to the rise of processed foods, ultra-processed foods, and everything else that's been incredibly damaging in the food service sector over the last several years. So I'm really excited to talk about this. I think we all see the downstream effects of ultra-processed foods, whether we call it out at the time, but the rise of diseases like obesity, metabolic syndromes, diabetes, all different types can be tracked back pretty compellingly to nutrition. And nutrition science is something, I'll admit, was something that was very weakly presented to me in med school. I think we talked and joked about it a little last time. I had to know how many grams of kilocalories of energy were in each gram of fat, and I was tested on that. And I, to this day, have no idea how to tie that to walking down a grocery store aisle. And so I'm really excited to bridge that gap here with our one and only subject matter expert, Dr. Gerald Cox. Today, we're joined by Dr. Gerald Cox, a physician, educator, and entrepreneur dedicated to preventing and reversing cardiometabolic disease. As a specialist in preventive medicine, obesity medicine, lifestyle medicine, internal medicine, and artificial intelligence, Dr. Cox has built his career on the future of preventative care by asking a simple but powerful question: how do we help people live longer, healthier lives? He serves as an associate professor at Loma Linda University. Loma Linda, one of the blue zones, if anybody did the centenarian research and saw they're one of the communities with some of the longest living people on the planet, so it makes sense. And is the co-founder of Mirror Health and Wellness, where his work focuses on improving patient outcomes, advancing population health, and building better systems of care for some of healthcare's most pressing challenges. Dr. Cox, welcome back to the podcast for Doctors by Doctors.
Dr. Palmer, it's always a pleasure hanging with you and being able to talk on some of these subjects to really enlighten people as to really what they're facing in their everyday lives.
And as always, we want to keep this as a clinical front. I think one of the challenges with those of us who went through, as much medical training as we have, decades of training, is there was never really a connection to the clinical. I would often just ask a dietitian to fix TPN, help me with TPN orders, or help me with tube feed orders, and that was the extent of what I got from clinical dietitians, right? And that is such a narrow window of what is food as medicine or nutrition as medicine. And so it's such a narrow lens into it that I'm here, and I'm glad that we're going to be kind of kicking that aperture wide open to talk about what kind of information can we give into our fellow clinicians every single day about how to, leverage healthier choices when it comes to food and what kind of clinical outcomes we can be looking at.
I completely agree with you, man. Honestly, you had me sold when you talked about the 9 kilocalories per gram of fats right there. I was like, oh man, I do remember that test question on USMLE. What was that? But honestly, if it weren't for me having been, obese as a child and then becoming a personal trainer and trying to lose weight myself with, different weight loss programs, I utilized that background more through my residency and fellowship training to help patients more than I was actually relying on my medical knowledge from sitting in lectures, in large lecture halls all day. So it's kind of wild. It seems like things are changing, which is great. But, with some of the things that were coming through the pipeline in medical training, it's pretty wild that wasn't an area of focus.
Absolutely. I mean, I'd love to hear a little bit about more of your history. We explored it last time, your history and why you're so passionate about obesity research and what it means to you. I think it's also important to call out you did this in the pre-Ozempic era, so hats off to you. Respect. You didn't just take the pill or the shot, you put in the sweat equity. So I understand why it resonates.
Gosh, yeah, the sweat equity is real, man. Those are hard-earned calories. Totally. Diet and lifestyle are the two hardest things to change, and we tell everybody they need to change them, and we don't give anybody any grace to do it. So no, usually we pass the buck, right? I'm going to send a referral.
Yeah.
Fortunately, you have a lot of connections that we could actually send some referrals to. I think you have a friend who's a dietitian as well.
Absolutely. Well, please, I'd love to hear more about, your personal connection with this story and how you came. Because again, there's obesity medicine, which obviously you're a specialist in, But then there's still nutrition science, right? And like food science, which are different, frankly, areas of life. Like whole careers where you could spend your time. So I'd love to hear how like as you became more trained in obesity medicine, how that transitioned into lifestyle, nutrition, and food as well.
Yeah, I think a lot of it really kind of came from my background through adolescence and actually being overweight, and then trying these different like weight loss programs. It's no surprise that things were making it into my diet that I didn't really recognize at the time. We're kind of subject to our environments, and that environment that I was in was really kind of leading to this excess weight. And I had to, I would be teased for it. Kids are some of the most honest people that we've met on the planet. So that was a bit of an eye-opening experience. But going through that weight loss program, I actually realized that there are choices that I can make to help me overcome some of these things. But I think what really spawned on me in this obesity and, lifestyle medicine, preventive medicine training was that it really wasn't as much of a choice as I originally thought. I think that we were recognizing more in the medical literature that what we believed to be a choice was actually something that was presented to us as an option that maybe we didn't really realize was more of an addiction or more of a compelling package. When you put a Christmas present in front of a child on the desk, they're going to be pretty impelled to open it. And, they may think it was their choice to open it, but really there's a lot of different components to their desire to open that package, if you will.
I completely, right? And I think I love immediately that tie-in of where for addiction medicine for so long, right? Like another field of study, addiction medicine for so long was really quick to blame the patient, right? Oh, it's a moral failing. It's, you're not close enough. You're not faith-based enough was obviously a very common moral failing. And increasingly we've seen that like there's chemistry at play here and there's biology at play here. And now in this world that we're going to talk about, we're going to layer on there's like human psychology at play and like a corporate, frankly, like motivation to manipulate and to try to extract as much value out of their users. So what I love is how as we've been kind of crafting this story, and I've been hearing you describe it to me as we've been planning for this. I really loved your historical take on this, and I would love for you to give me the historical rundown of how we got here. One of my favorite lines from you is that we, the people, lost control of our food supply. I love that line. I think it's deeply American. Once we found out who we lost control to. But please, like, I love the way that, like your layout of the history of how we got to where we are here today.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. We're coming up on the 250th anniversary of the United States. And as you mentioned, we, the people, is always that preamble that, kind of really just hits home, right? And so as we're preparing for this upcoming 250th anniversary, that we, the people, have lost control of our food supply. We no longer are making things from these minimal ingredients, right? I mean, I remember my significant other brought me she's like, I got back from Trader Joe's and I got some great things here, some protein bars here so we can have some snacks. And I'm like, great. She's like, would you like one? I was like, yeah, sure. Let me take a look. And so immediately I go to that ingredients section. I'm just like, that's a lot of stuff. I wish it were just peanuts and rolled oats, maybe, and maybe some things that bind it together. But no, this was just like this is a Rolodex. This is I got the calories here, the carbs, and then the rest is going to the bottom of the box: riboflavin, enriched flour, also emulsifying agents. I'm like, what in the but you think, I went to Trader Joe's, I got something healthy, but even then you got to really see the breakdown of things because we're no longer in the era of minimal processed ingredients, which is making it quite a difficult thing for us to overcome as we talked about those choices that are being made.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and as we've moved away, like we're going to spend a lot of time talking about like the contents of food, right? Because the crux of what we're going to be discussing is the rise of literature on ultra-processed foods, which have certain definitions around them, but really it goes back to the components that go into the food specifically. So there's a couple of things that you had referenced previously. There's the bet you can't have just one, that ad campaign, which was classic. I feel like anybody growing up in our era, like, was used to seeing that. So there's the food science on one side, right, of that laundry list of components that's going in. But then there's also the psychology component of the advertising psychology and human psychology. So can you speak to a little bit to the bet you can't have just one and how that plays into the human psyche and decision making? And
Let's dive right into that, Dr. Palmer. So right now we have this term that's really making its way around the medical literature today, and I hope that it actually starts to translate more into social media and more the consumer side of things. But there's this term called flavor engineering, and for me, it really kind of became something that popped up to me when the American Journal of Public Health just recently released a very large repertoire of original research, and that's made its way into a lot of news outlets, NPR News, CNN, BBC, national, international news networks that are talking about this American Journal of Public Health and these publishings on ultra-processed foods. But flavor engineering was a term that came out to me, and I was like, what? I understand that there's food science, like we just referenced, but engineering and food? Like, where are we going with this? I know that when we talked about that Trader Joe's run, I'm looking at the ingredients, and I'm like, what are all these things that are making it in? I just want, maybe some peanuts and a banana, maybe some, like a peanut butter and banana. Yeah, that sounds pretty good right now, or some celery and carrots and some peanut butter. That's a pretty short list of ingredients, but this whole idea of flavor engineering took a completely different approach as I started investigating it further. And what I found was it actually combined these different disciplines. It was more of like, the science of taste and aroma making its way, and image even, making its way into the food and beverages and even pharmaceuticals. So as I was doing this deep dive, I was like, you know what, this is kind of wild. I didn't realize that some of these things are being propagated and sold to us and marketed to us in a way in which we think we have a choice, but we're actually more of being influenced and pushed in a certain direction. One good example that I found was actually, NyQuil. We go down the CVS aisle, we're looking at NyQuil, we're like, oh, there's that purple stuff, like Dave Chappelle, there's that purple stuff. They were like, that's going to be some good sleep right there, or we look at it like, oh, that orange daytime, yeah, that's going to just really get my day started. I'm here sniffling and, coughing, and my throat is sore. I really need to get my day started because I got work to do, right? So we look at that orange bottle and we're like, yeah, that's going to get me up and going. But what's wild is that we really don't realize that a lot of that NyQuil doesn't look like that, right? I mean, NyQuil has been engineered to promote itself to us that way. There's red 40 that's in there that actually gives it that deep red color, or that blue #1 that gives it that brilliant blue color that actually compels us to have these beliefs in how they're going to work for our bodies. But the wild thing is, some of these dyes, we're starting to see a lot of public health research making its way out there showing that there's some association with neurobehavioral issues, things like ADHD, hyperactivity, restlessness, and being absent in attention. And, some of those blue dyes even, making its way into our, obviously some of, we think we're giving our children something to help them with their cold, but really kind of it can affect their behavior. So that was kind of interesting to me. That was a deep dive. And then I started looking at one of my own weaknesses, Dr. Palmer. I started looking at truffle oil, right? Because those truffle flies, they come at you. You get that whiff. You're like, oh.
You get the whiff.
You get the whiff, right?
You get the whiff, yeah.
And I was like, okay, well, those truffle mushrooms, those are expensive culinary ingredients right there. That's going to be good. You have to have it. But, I started looking at some truffle oil, but lo and behold, even that was more of a what's happening in truffle oil is that they say that it's natural, a natural product, right? It's natural truffle aroma or natural truffle flavor. But what that allows, there's some loopholes in the way in which that can be presented. Really what it comes down to is like that aroma has been broken down by food scientists as 2,4, I think it's called like dithiapentene or something like that. And what it is just an extracted molecule, and it can come from different things like petroleum. It can come from plants or animals or microbiological like sources like bacterial fermentation. But when it comes from the actual mushroom, that's incredibly expensive. So what a lot of corporations or commercial producers of truffle oil have done is that they've extracted, sometimes from petroleum, that would be like an artificial truffle flavor, or they can extract it from plants or other sources of food that kind of produce a little bit of it. Sometimes like cheeses, certain cheeses can have that 2,4-dithiapentene in it, and they can extract it and then add that extraction to a regular based oil. So you think you're having that truffle oil that's actually, just a truffle mushroom, but really and truthfully, it's actually a lot more than that. You're just taking this extraction of this flavor engineering approach to plopping in there. And now you have this really cheap product that you can sell for a premium because people know those truffle mushrooms are expensive, but you're not really getting it. And those are the little loopholes in flavor engineering that are allowing larger corporations to really market those things to us.
Yeah, I love the term flavor engineering because as we've increasingly seen and frankly have felt just by being on the planet for a couple decades, like that you see more and more of this version of like imitation type foods. For me, my first inroad wasn't truffle oil. I'm not as truffle addicted as you, as we've talked about. Mine was vanilla. They've been running vanilla extract as a deeply engineered product that extracts the vanilla molecule effectively, and then they're able to reproduce it also in petroleum engineering. And then they put it in a little bit of alcohol, a little brown food coloring, and off to the races. Completely different than a naturally occurring like vanilla product that comes, almost typically from Madagascar or the Caribbean. And so again, it's this like, in some ways, like it's expanded access to things, but these aren't what I think we would consider like essential food groups, right? These were luxury items that we've expanded access to via flavor engineering. And I think some of that flavor engineering now has worked its way down into what are like the essentials going into like our bodies as food groups and things like that. And I think a big part of that is especially in this country is you have massive food, like a substantial food industry as we should, but has become very, very corporatized. And this actually goes back to the 80s. And so I'd love for you to talk to me about kind of like the merging of two, kind of like the villains of our story in a way. I feel comfortable saying that, just given the history here. But the villains of our story here is when big tobacco started to go after processed foods as a source of income. So I'd love for you to explain that to me and to our listeners.
Yeah, when you and I were talking about, sharing some of this information and knowledge with the general public, we were going through some of these articles that made it out in this publication. And, it's wild when you look at how some of this really kind of kickstarted, right? I mean, when you look at the 1980s and you saw a lot of this, evil villain work about, these tobacco companies, and there was a lot of public health knowledge and information that was coming out. There was the link of lung cancer associated with tobacco smoke that wasn't believed for a very long time. And then when people started feeling that they were addicted to some of these products, then, we started seeing some legislation starting to roll out, and tobacco companies were getting a lot of heat in the 80s. But then they very wisely decided to diversify their portfolio, right? And so one of those pivots of diversifying that portfolio is how do we utilize a lot of what we've learned, a lot of what we've researched and poured a lot of money into, and apply that to another industry. And so what we started seeing, and you can actually, there are great articles in this massive publication that came out, but what we started seeing was Philip Morris, for example, the makers of Marlboro and these very popular ZYN nicotine lozenges or packets that you can buy. They bought a company called General Foods.
No, I have to say, Dr. Cox, you're so healthy that you don't know it's pronounced Zin. That's what Gen Z and the kids call it. Yeah. I have to call it out that you're so apart from this. You're so apart from this that this is an amazing moment. This is how healthy you are. That you're like, oh, it's an acronym, right? It's got to be an acronym. It's capital letters. That's incredible. That's incredible. So.
It's funny. I may not recognize that they're ZYN or Zin patches, but you know what I do recognize? Jell-O, Kool-Aid, and Tang. That's what I recognize right there. And I didn't realize that General Foods, the makers of those products were bought by Philip Morris and the tobacco companies. I had no idea. I was just a kid in the 1990s growing up like, man, I got to have some Tang with my cereal. I don't know why, but the way that this is marketed to me on television, and those were some great marketing campaigns, by the way, really just kind of spun out products from these tobacco industries as a means to diversify the portfolio. I didn't know that Philip Morris was busting into my living room as the Kool-Aid man. You know what I mean? Oh, yeah. Like I didn't know that, right? So it's pretty wild when you kind of go into that history.
I don't think anybody would have invited the Marlboro Man in like we did the Kool-Aid Man. So I totally agree with you. No, it's just not well understood. I mean, there's such... there's so much of this. It's not a difficult turn to recognize that tobacco companies, which took natural products and then engineered them in a way to be like mass produced and delivered to people, right? Like tobacco, historically a cash crop, a luxury item, went through the same cycle as then we saw happen in this very rapid kind of like 40-year expansion post 80s of taking natural products or food-based products or plant-based products and then like increasing that engineering cycle to expand their ability to deliver. I, to this day, couldn't tell you what's in Tang or in Kool-Aid. But you see how ubiquitous and easy they were to manufacture and get out to everybody. So it's they're just following a playbook that they've done for hundreds of years, companies like Philip Morris. And then, R.J. Reynolds followed similarly. So
very true. When we look even further, you start seeing things like, R.J. Reynolds, the makers of American Spirits and Camels and Newports back in the day, they had to make a similar move to kind of stay competitive, right? So they bought Nabisco. I don't know about anybody else, but it's certainly difficult for me to have just one Oreo, or Ritz cracker. Goodness gracious, Cadbury. Everyone loves a little Cadbury, right? So, knowing that was actually, purchased by another tobacco company is pretty wild. Oscar Mayer, Capri Sun. This is Lunchables. I loved making my Lunchable pizza, but I didn't realize that Lunchable pizza was actually a delivered product of years of doing these control groups on children. Right. And these control groups, to try to understand like, oh, kids like the autonomy of being able to put together their lunches. I have to say, one of the most interesting things that I found in one of these research papers, and it talks to the point of this food engineering that you and I have been discussing, is that the way that they did the molecular structure around some of these proteins inside of the lunches that got delivered, they were actually able to do it in a very, very scientific, almost pharmaceutical way, where some of these tasteful flavors were surrounded by lipoprotein structures that actually delayed the release of that flavor or delayed the release of that additive inside of the food so that it can actually hit some of those dopamine serotonergic pathways. So neurologically, we are literally being kind of hijacked in a way to, by some of these very technical methods in some of these foods to make this food really compelling to us and, really speak to that campaign of, can you really just have one, Dr. Palmer?
Can you really have just one? Yeah. And their multi-billion-dollar bet was no. You're not just going to have one, and because frankly, we're pulling some levers here. So,
oh, you mean like a Wizard of Oz, just back there?
Yeah. Exactly. As we're controlling the ingredients that go into these things. I was also thinking Charlie and the Chocolate Factory a little bit in that same, like cartoonishly evil manufacturing. So
right. All those bright colors.
All those bright colors and everything that goes into it. I'd love to hear a little bit more. Nabisco, probably I think most of us now would recognize it as a craft company. And so there was also some horse trading and some consolidation here in the industry.
Yeah, right. I mean, when you have Philip Morris just turning into the General Foods, and then what you end up seeing was that they were a major success. A smashing success to that point where they were actually able to acquire craft foods at the time. And so those, that Lunchables that made its way to my lunchbox, that DiGiorno's pizza that I loved to purchase in high school or college, those Oscar Mayer hot dogs that made it on the grill, Capri Sun that made it its way to soccer practice, all of those things were really just part of the story of tobacco's diversification. Interestingly, that's when we started that industry of the tobacco industry, and then the merging of those different food companies eventually started to see some corporate drama at the time. It actually inspired, I'm not too sure if you're familiar with the book or the movie Barbarians at the Gate. Have you come across that term or that title?
No.
It was pretty wild. I'm telling you, as you start looking at some of how these things happen in this research that came out, it will lead you down some Alice in Wonderland, just rabbit holes of knowledge. So Barbarians at the Gate, what ended up happening there was that they tried to sell out or tried to purchase the shares of the company, and they wanted to try to bring that internally. But then there was this really just aggressive takeover, if you will, by other people who wanted to buy in on this really booming industry. So much so that they actually ended up kicking out their CEO and doing it themselves. It's very famous testimony that happened in Congress around the 1990s. You know, as you and I were talking about this earlier, it was pretty wild to see the intricacies of really what was happening on a business perspective, because I know that you know a lot about the business and the financials things that go on. I think you really can speak to that. But, you know, the financials, the business structuring, and this really desire to expand into new emerging markets that were really bringing in trillions of dollars and really leading to a healthy or unhealthy consumerish behavior of buying into some of these ingredients.
That brings us through some of the history of kind of how these food companies came to be in this area of flavor engineering and how they've come to basically, you know, really scientize the food, focused, you know, predominantly on customer uptake, their production costs, with really only a limited exploration of the health aspect of it. The American Journal of Public Health has just published an entire landmark collection of studies around ultra-processed foods. But before we start to dive into that, I want to explore some of the background topics on addiction here, right? Like, because I think where we're going to go and what we're going to talk about is that there's a really big Venn diagram overlap between, you know, your food addiction types or your food types that you're describing. You know, you already mentioned the dopaminergic pathways that we're all aware of, right? Like those are the same exact pathways that work in other areas of addiction. You know, a lot of us think of like food diseases are based around anorexia, bulimia, binging. Like we don't really think of the addictive capacity of it as much. So, you know, I'd love to hear from you and your specialist in obesity medicine and lifestyle medicine. Like, what role does food and can food play in that addiction pathway and lighting up that addiction pathway in the brain?
Yeah, it's very interesting. One of the articles that actually focus on using some artificial intelligence to actually try to look into the delivery in which some of these macronutrients are being put together in a way that actually lights up our brain pathways. You know, what we saw, and it was a pretty good study. I like studies that you can actually feel like you can reproduce on your own, or if you had the right team, right? So this one was almost reproducible, was really well done. So what they found was that the combination of one being high caloric, right? So usually like foods that are like beans and carrots and celery, things that really go into like a traditional chili without the meat, right? Those things can be somewhat protective because of the high amount of water content inside of them. And they're also very low caloric. But when you start to look at some of these drier, less water content, high calorie density meals or foods, those tend to light up the brain a little bit more, especially when you add a high fat content to them. And so they delve into a little bit of some of the breakdown of some saturated fats, particularly palmitic fat, that can be emphasized with adding a little bit of salt. So the fat, the calorie density, the salt to emphasize that flavor, but also the glycemic carbohydrate load. So the higher the glycemic carbohydrate load and the higher that total carbohydrate load, that really leads to that glucose spike and that insulin spike that really triggers the body to start acting in a very physiologic way, because, you know, hyperglycemia is a very big no-no when it comes to body chemistry, right? So the body really tries to work hard to address that. But when you have this flavor or this macronutrient profile, particularly usually low in fiber to blunt that glucose response in the bloodstream, that high total carbohydrate load, particularly higher glycemic agents, higher calories, and a higher fat content, particularly those saturated fats like palmitic fat, then we start to see that people were identifying foods that had that ratio as being more problematic, being more addicting. And for me as a child, remember we were talking about those choices that I thought I was making. Like, why am I making these choices? I should just choose something different. I should choose the peanut butter and celery, or the cottage cheese. I shouldn't choose this Lunchable or this Slim Jim and that Slurpee, right? I shouldn't walk into AM/PM and think everything on the countertop is healthy, But it really may not have been that choice. That young Dr. Cox, that young Gerald, walking those aisles thinking he had a choice, really I may have been exposing myself to, or might have been exposed in an environment that was really making it difficult for me to make these choices because of the influence of that dopamine serotonergic pathway that you were referencing.
Absolutely. I mean, it's such an important part of where there's a control aspect of the food and the foods that are out there, right? It's I think it's really important then, and especially when we talk clinically, in one of our follow-on episodes here, when we talk about the clinical impacts, it's really important to meet your customers with that grace and recognize that they're up against really like a biochemical manipulation here, trying to get them to take on these foods, that they start to associate those just like nicotine, just like other addictive substances, that gives them that positive feedback loop and those deep parts of the brainstem that we all learned in med school and haven't talked about since. But they're critically important in the understanding of addiction science here.
And I'm so glad you tied that in, right? We're trying to get people to, other clinicians to realize, right? I mean, when you're talking about these things clinically, we think as we in medical school we're going through, we're like, oh, maybe we have to talk to people about, no, choose this instead of that. Choose this instead of that. Try to limit this intake, right? But, Yale has this food addiction scale that actually allows us to really try to hone in on some of the patients that are having a difficult time. But this was a validated scale. It's called, I might be pronouncing this wrong because I got Zen wrong. This is called YFAS, but we could just call it YFAS. So this is like a psychometrical tool that they use to look into the diagnostics of understanding addiction a little bit further and the role that the addictive process that are leading to problematic eating behavior. So if some clinicians were to, and this is free, a lot of clinicians can find this online, but this is something that we can actually use to screen some of the patients that are coming into our clinic because they might need, like what you were saying, a little bit more help with addiction medicine, potentially being involved as a consultation, or a little bit more hand-holding, more closer follow-ups, because really, just like alcohol or tobacco products, there may be a food addiction that's going on in someone's life that they may not have control of. And so I'm really happy that you bring up the tie-in to how we clinically can incorporate this into our practices.
100%, and we'll make sure that we leave a link to that Yale EFAS or EFAS scale or however we choose to pronounce it. We'll make sure that we leave a link to the show notes, link in the show notes for our listeners, just because it's a fascinating tool. It's very quick and easy to deploy, which is great for clinical tools. And it's just like every other screening tool, right? Like a PHQ-9 or GAD or something like that. These are meant to be deployed in a way to understand your patients much more quickly and to understand them at a deeper level. People come to food from so many different places, like understanding how much of it is playing in, I think will absolutely help the clinical part of this. But we're sticking with the academic for this episode. The American Journal of Public Health that we've been talking about, these landmark studies, they've released what a year after from the Lancets, what I would consider the Lancet in England. They did an absolutely incredible full session reporting on ultra-processed foods, what a lot of people were saying a bombshell against the food processing industry or the ultra-processed food industry, excuse me. But please, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it and the health impacts of ultra-processed food consumption and kind of like what's so important about this article and why is it being released now? Articles, excuse me.
Yeah, the Lancet was a great bombshell report that came out last year, and you and I got an opportunity to speak to the public a little bit about that. But the great thing about the Lancet was really, I think they really internationally opened up the discussion about, public policy, and really ultra-processed foods have become an industry in of itself, because at first, in the earlier stages of food production and mass food production in the realms of globalization, we had more of an issue with how do we preserve foods, right? We have someone who makes food, and then how do we preserve it so it can make its way to someone who wants to consume that food? But then as, globalization happened and food became more complex, it was really expensive, right? For people to be able to basically maintain this food ingredient to keep it fresh to your table. I mean, I still remember my parents, they talk about, man, back in the day, a Twinkie was a real cake. Now, that sucker's sitting on the shelf for 20 years and looks exactly the same. I still get concerned when I get some bread from the store and I look at it and I'm like, yeah, I haven't eaten it in 2 weeks, but why does it still look the same? I don't know.
It looked the same. Yeah.
So, we've kind of gotten from how we preserve food to how do we make food very cheap to produce and highly consumable. So we've shifted from preserving to ultra processing, because then it's, if it goes to waste, then not much is lost. And if it's consumed, then a lot is gained on a capital intensive front, right? And so the Lancet really opened us our eyes to that, how this was happening internationally and how the food supply was happening internationally. And it spoke a little bit more on some obesity aspects and how this is really leading to chronic health issues inside of the world. And I really loved how they just chose to do their calling with that. I think that the American Journal of Public Health had more of a national response, which is making international news. And their emphasis was actually that Alice in Wonderland dive that you and I are talking about, right? That like, oh, whoa, what food engineering processes, literally chemical and drug delivery processes inside of the food to make things more palatable, to make things more sensational, to change the character of how we're palating food. I know when I talk to some of my patients, they say, Dr. Cox, my biggest issue are chips. I don't necessarily have like a desire for the taste of chips. It's really that crunch. And I'm like, oh, the crunch. I get you. That crunch was really put together through a lot of studies and a lot of scientific research to really get that preservation of that, that specific technical palatable experience that really people feel they must have. And so I think that the American Journal of Public Health, they did a very beautiful investigation of some of these techniques. And I really want to give a huge shout out to Dr. Schmidt. She came out of the University of California, San Francisco.
UCSF.
Yeah, UCSF. And she did this entire publication on her own, single author on this paper. And she deserves a lot of credit. It's getting a lot of attention. But what she did was this beautiful approach looking at the quality improvement processes that the tobacco industries transferred into the food industry. And it focused on things like those study groups on children, study groups on mothers who were looking for quick and healthy meals for their children and what they were looking for. And it was interesting, some of the things that, they wanted it to be kind of cute. They wanted it to be, something that the kids would enjoy, that's something that was still healthy for them. And they took the information that they gained from those study groups and incorporated it into some of their marketing campaigns to really push these products. And so I thought that the American Journal's publication was really a continuation of what the Lancet had to say and what they shared with us. And I'm really looking forward to more of these landmark publications that are coming out, because I think that the public is really starting to pay more attention.
Absolutely. I mean, even having these two different, I would say like august publications, like truly massive, like, practice changing publications, dedicate entire volumes to this, I think speaks to the tailwind that we have behind addressing the crisis that we're facing of food as unhealth when we're doing it poorly, and how it's affecting people really now more on a global scale even. So, I'm actually really excited that we're starting to get this time and attention to it. I want to address very briefly what I think we need to address is kind of the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which is a lot of this aligns with the Make America Healthy Again programming out of Robert F. Kennedy's HHS, and a lot of the messaging that's being forced out of the CDC now. Now, it's what's challenging here is there's the politics, and then there's the policy, and then there's the actual like philosophy underneath it all. And I think what's been difficult for me as a clinician, I'd love to hear your approach to it, is in a kind of bizarre way, I think we're all philosophically in alignment. Nobody walks through a grocery store and has a good feeling about the food they're seeing, right? Like the Maha movement is responding to an emotion, right? I want to buy things for my kids and not have to worry about a formula recall every 3 months or something else that's going on. Like there's just a separation of like our comfort and our confidence in the industry of the food and what we see. It's more accessible than ever, but I don't feel good about it. And so they're responding to that movement. Now, there's obviously, look, I'm a pediatrician. My feelings about vaccines are out there. You can all go find them. Shockingly, you'll find out that I'm generally in favor of them as a public health practitioner. But it's you know, like, so there's areas of the MAHA movement that I think are getting dragged along. But in general, the philosophy around food, like, I actually think there's probably a lot of us that would align around, like, that emotion of just not feeling confident about the food supply that we have and what we have. So, and you know, then what we're giving to our families and our loved ones and things like that. There's been an erosion in that trust. And so I'd love to hear, you know, I just want to address it head on because, you know, food dyes are a major target of Robert F. Kennedy's HHS. And so there's some alignment here that I think we can all agree on. We just don't want to get dragged into the fringes.
Yes, and you know, and I think that's really, you know, I think that's really what's really exciting about having this moment in our history. You know, I think that people were kind of tired of the same old, a lack of, we can call it a lack of some FDA oversight. I would actually like to call it a outdated terminology repertoire inside of the FDA that actually allows people or industries and companies to label certain foods as being natural products when they're just, you know, what the quote of being natural is just to be derived from a source of being a plant or, you know, an animal product, not necessarily the product of that source. So, you know, I can basically take, you know, like we could use our truffle example, and I can extract some component or compound that tastes like truffle from a plant that's not truffle and maximize it and put it into an oil and call it a natural flavoring, right? That's not, I don't know if that biochemical compound is natural, but what I'm trying to say is that I feel like what Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has done is create a lot of excitement and eyeballs to what's coming next. And the interesting thing is it's not necessarily, we look at the general public, right? We're public health officials. And so we look at that general public and we see the level of excitement in the public. Like you said, people aren't really comfortable going down that aisle with the chips and being blinded by, you know, yellow, red, and blue, just so many colors. I'm kind of getting dizzy even thinking about it, right? But no one really feels comfortable going down that aisle, right? Because we know what that aisle contains. That aisle has the sodas and the chips and sometimes the cereals that we know are not really great for us. But, you know, I think that excitement inside the public is equally seen in that excitement and some fear in the medical community. And I think that the medical community is looking like, okay, so what's going to change? And you've already mentioned some things like the fringes, like, you know, the vaccine recommendations have changed and not for the better based off of the medical research that we have. But I'm actually very excited for Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s, I guess, aura in this realm. Because a lot of people don't know this, but Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was an environmental lawyer before he somehow found his way to this role through, you know, applying for trying to become a president. And I think that it's kind of one of those instances where everything kind of comes together at the right time. And, you know, because what we're facing today is an environmental crisis, right? And I think that if since he is an attorney in this particular field of law, then I hope that he can truly apply some of what he's learned and fought for in his time as an attorney into the space of healthcare. Because what we're looking at is truly an environmental issue in which we have lost control of the food supply that is making its way to our dinner tables and in our kitchen plates. And so I'm really hoping that, you know, this war on obesity and chronic disease really becomes a magnifying lens in some of the processes that are allowing some of these foods to make it to us. So, you know, I think that, you know, as challenging as it has been for us in medicine over the last decade, I hope that and hope, maybe we send this podcast to him just so that he can actually take a listen. But, because we would be great on his counsel, I feel like, right? Let's examine the way in which some of these things are making it to us. And let's put maybe some updates on some terminology to really try to limit the misunderstandings and misinformation that's making its way to purchasing some of these products. And let's do it in a way that still protects company autonomy and consumer autonomy, because we all should have the ability to make the right choice.
Absolutely. I think, I love what you're getting at, is that there's a whole advocacy component of this, right? Like when it comes to changing policy, when it comes to changing the politics behind it, there's a necessity right now and a moment and actually a space for it, most importantly, for advocacy in trying to update some of this terminology and trying to educate the populace in terms of what these words actually mean, in terms of forcing companies to represent themselves honestly when they bring this food and these food products to market. I think there's, in public health, we often talk about the Overton window of what possibilities are coming together. There's often kind of like a 4-dimensional game to bring public health policies and updates to bear. And there is a tailwind right now, with RFK Jr.'s focus on this and his perhaps bombastic, perhaps in some ways a little bit ridiculous, his behavior. It's keeping people focused on this moment, though, in a way that really hasn't been, and I'm very excited about it. So I wanted to end this session talking about the level of impact that we've seen of these ultra processed foods here. And what kind of food policies have we seen, and what do we have from at least a correlation standpoint that some of the damage and some of the impact that we're seeing here?
It's really tough, right? When we look at what Congress is really rolling out today, there's just so much noise happening in the world right now, and it's really hard. It's leading to a lot of mental health issues, a lot of stress. And honestly is leading to a large divide economically speaking, right? And that divide is placing more and more people into relying on some of these public health initiatives like SNAP benefits and WIC, and basically these public benefits that people can utilize in times of need to be able to sustain their families. You would probably be able to speak very well on this, given your nature as a pediatrician, and I'm sure you've seen a lot of mothers and fathers come to your clinic or be present with their hospitalized child and speak to you on some of these social determinants that are really making it challenging for them to maintain a healthy lifestyle and healthy balance. Right now, and we can argue about the food pyramid that's been revised, because speaking with some of my nutritionist and dietitian friends, and even based off my own research, there is room for improvement, to say lightly. Having meat at the top of the pyramid doesn't jive well with lipid profiles for sure. I really hope that when it comes to Congress, when it comes to RFK and his position, when it comes to this administration, that they open their hearts and their minds to what we, the people, have been able to observe over time, and what nutrition and dietary guidelines and oversight to really harp on some of these changes that this administration can roll out very quickly to be the leaders in this industry of nutrition, to really address these ultra processed foods that are ultimately leading to excessive expenditure in the healthcare industry, right? So, I think that we're wise enough, we're mature enough, Dr. Palmer, that we're not necessarily calling on these companies to be punished or banned. People should have the choice to choose what they allow. But it would be great to inspire or encourage these companies to do some charity and invest in healthcare. Right, to do some because ultimately healthcare is good for public health, for the common good, and we truly need to. I think that this will be calling on companies to truly diversify their portfolios, because I think there's a lot that we can learn from this playbook, and I think that we can incorporate those teachings into public policies that will ultimately benefit the nation and the world at large. So. All this is to say, and I'm gonna let you kind of speak on the policy tie into things like SNAP and WIC. But I think that we have an opportunity here. It may be a once in a lifetime opportunity, at least in our generation, because we have so much momentum from the public, from the healthcare sector, and people in place, those public officials who can really roll this thing out in a very fast and decisive way.
I absolutely love that. And I love the enthusiasm and the optimism about where it is. I think the optimism is something that's been, frankly, a little sorely missing for a lot of us in public health recently, but seeing the opportunity that we have in front of us is amazing. So, Dr. Cox, we the people, thank you for joining me at the podcast for Doctors by Doctors. Please, we're going to do a follow-up session where we talk about the clinical impacts, where we bring in a dietitian who's going to help guide us through clinical encounters and how we can take this mountain of information about ultra-processed foods and bring it to bedside and make our encounters more fruitful. Make our patients healthier, and then talk through what we can then do next from a policy standpoint. So please stay tuned for the next episode with Dr. Cox. We're very much looking forward to it. And thank you again for joining me at the podcast for Doctors by Doctors.
Thank you, Dr. Palmer. Truly a pleasure being here and being able to speak to the public. Looking forward to the next one.
Thank you again.
Thanks for joining us this episode. You can catch the podcast for Doctors by Doctors on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and all the major podcasting platforms. If you enjoyed this episode or learned anything here today, please take a moment to give us a rating and subscribe so that you don't miss a single episode release. As always, thank you for listening. And the next time you see a doctor, maybe you should prescribe this podcast. We'll see you next time.